So have you heard the crazy story about the guy who literally stumbled onto a real-life infinite money glitch?
So, the guy's name is Dan. And when this whole wild ride kicks off, Dan is just a regular 29-year-old bartender making a living down in Australia. It's a random night in 2011. Dan is out at a local bar, throwing back a few drinks, just having a completely normal, good time. But at some point in the night, he realizes his wallet is empty. He's out of cash. So he leaves the bar and takes a quick walk down the street to the nearest ATM. He pops his card into the machine and tries to do a simple transfer, moving $200 from his credit card over to his savings account so he can withdraw it.
But for whatever reason, the machine isn't having it. The screen just blinks, transaction canceled, and spits his card right back out at him.
Dan is standing there thinking, okay, well, that's incredibly weird. He decides to give it one more shot.
But this time, instead of transferring anything, he just tries to withdraw $200 straight out of his savings account.
And to his absolute shock, the machine starts whirring, and it actually hands him the cash.
Now, here is the catch. Dan knew for a fact he did not have $200 sitting in his savings account. It was completely empty. Something was clearly glitching. But Dan is a few drinks deep at this point, right?
He's not exactly in the mood to play detective. He just thinks, awesome, I got my money, I'm heading right back to the bar. Fast forward a few hours. Dan is finally heading home for the night, and he happens to walk right past that exact same ATM. And that little voice in his head goes, man, I really wonder if that glitch is still working. He puts his card back in. He does the exact same phantom transfer from his credit card to his savings and tries to withdraw another $200. It works. Cash in hand. Now Dan's heart is really beating. He thinks, okay, I have to push this. He punches in $500. It works. He punches in $600. It works again.
At this exact moment, Dan realizes he might have just cracked the code to unlimited wealth. He runs the loop a few more times,
stuffs his pockets with cash, and heads home.
Now, I won't bore you with the dense coding details of how this system failure happened, but over the next few weeks,
Dan does his own field testing and realizes the golden rule of his glitch.
Between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the bank's ATMs temporarily disconnect from the main server.
If he transfers money during that offline window, his account balance stays completely positive, and he can just pull physical cash out of thin air, forever. Or, until the cops show up.
So Dan just leans into it. Every single night he's at the ATM. In just the first 14 days, he manually pulls out
more than $20,000, night by night, stack by stack. And every single morning, he wakes up fully expecting the police to kick his front door off its hinges.
But the day passes. Nothing. Another week passes. The bank doesn't call. They don't send a letter.
At one point, Dan even walks into a physical bank branch just to see if the tellers give him a weird look or tell him his account is flagged. Absolutely nothing happens.
So he hits the gas pedal. Before long, he has exploited the ATMs so many times that he is technically a millionaire.
And Dan says to himself, forget it. I'm just going to live like a king. And oh boy, he does. He starts dining at Michelin star restaurants. He's booking the penthouses at 5-star hotels. He's flying around the world, taking photos in Paris. One weekend, he literally drops $90,000 to charter a private jet just to take his buddies to a remote island in Asia. He starts gambling heavily.
But he's also surprisingly generous. He starts tipping random waiters hundreds of bucks
and even pays for hotel rooms so homeless people can sleep in a real bed for a night. He's living the absolute dream. And when people start asking questions about where this bottomless pit of cash is coming from, he just casually lies. He tells everyone he got into investment banking or high-end real estate. Everyone just buys it.
But here is where the fairy tale starts to turn into a horror movie. Dan was a lot of things, but he wasn't a hardened criminal.
He wasn't built for the underworld. And slowly, the paranoia starts rotting his brain. Every single morning, he wakes up in a cold sweat, wondering, is today the day my life ends?
He is literally having nightmares about SWAT teams surrounding his house. Every time his phone vibrates, his stomach drops,
thinking it's the bank calling to say, "We found you, Dan." And ironically, when the bank did call, it was just standard customer service checking on his security because he was spending so much.
Dan knew he had an out. He had millions in cash. He could easily pack a bag, fly to a country without an extradition treaty,
And disappear forever. But that meant never seeing his family again, never seeing his real friends. Finally, he just couldn't take the mental torture anymore. He was totally burned out. So after a wild 4-month run and after withdrawing over 1.6 million Australian dollars, Dan stops. He decides to come clean. Honest Dan picks up the phone, calls his bank,
and confesses to the entire $1.6 million heist. But the bank's reaction is bizarre. They basically say, listen, we can't really do anything about this right this second.
but we are absolutely reporting you to the police, and they will be at your door very soon. Dan hangs up the phone, sits on his couch, and waits to be arrested. He waits, and he waits, and he waits. 3 whole years go by. It is now 2014,
And not a single cop has knocked on his door. The bank literally never followed up. Now, if you or I got away with $1 million bank heist and the cops just ghosted us,
we'd probably thank our lucky stars and move on, right? Not Dan. The guilt is eating him alive so badly that he goes to see a psychiatrist to cope with the stress of not being arrested. The psychiatrist basically tells him that the only way to clear his conscience is to turn himself in.
but Dan thinks, well, the cops ignored me last time. So he comes up with a different strategy.
He decides to go public. He starts giving interviews. He goes on national television to broadcast his unbelievable story to millions of viewers. And that is exactly what brings him down. A producer working on one of those TV shows hears the story, picks up the phone behind Dan's back, and tips off the police. It turns out there was never any investigation. The bank completely forgot to report him. If Dan hadn't gone on national TV begging for attention, he would have lived the rest of his life as a free man.
But he essentially forced them to arrest him. So Dan is finally handcuffed and taken to court.
But this is the best part of the whole story. At his trial, it becomes painfully obvious that nobody in the courtroom actually understands what Dan did. The prosecutor is confused. The judge is confused. The bank's own security experts cannot explain how their ATMs gave away $1 million. And because the bank couldn't technically explain the mechanics of the crime, the judge couldn't throw the book at him. For stealing $1.6 million and living like a rock star,
Dan was sentenced to just 1 single year in prison. Honestly, I think he won that trade.